Why China refines 90% of the rare earth metals the world runs on September 2010. A Chinese fishing trawler is working the waters near a cluster of uninhabited islands the Japanese call the Senkaku and the Chinese call the Diaoyu. A Japanese Coast Guard patrol boat moves in. The trawler doesn't stop. It rams the patrol boat, not once but twice, and the captain is hauled off in handcuffs to a jail in Naha, Okinawa, on charges of obstructing Japanese officials. On paper, this is a fishing dispute, a rock in the ocean nobody lives on. The kind of story that runs on page 9 and disappears by the weekend. It didn't disappear. Within days, Chinese customs officials in ports like Shanghai and Ningbo started slow-walking a category of shipments almost nobody outside a handful of industries had ever heard of. No public decree, no press conference, just paperwork that stopped moving, inspections that took a little longer than they used to, containers that sat on docks collecting dust while the manifests got reviewed. The shipments were rare earth elements, and within weeks, Japanese manufacturers, the people who build the motors in Toyota hybrids, the lasers and precision optics, the magnets in wind turbines, were calling suppliers in a panic. Prices for materials that used to trade for a few dollars a kilogram spiked past 100. Some spiked past 500. A company that needed 40 tons of neodymium a month suddenly couldn't get 4. Here's the question that should stop you cold. How does a boat collision over a pile of uninhabited rock turn into a supply crisis for the Japanese electronics industry in under a month? What kind of grip lets one country reach into a fight over fishing rights and squeeze a lever 3,000 miles away in factories that have nothing to do with fish or islands at all? That's the real story here. Not the boat, the lever. Because what happened in 2010 wasn't an accident of geography or a fluke of bad diplomacy. It was the first public demonstration of something China had been quietly assembling for the better part of 2 decades. A chokehold not on rocks in the ground, but on what happens to those rocks after they come out of it. And once you understand the difference between those two things, mining versus refining, digging versus processing, you start to see why the number everyone repeats, China controls 90% of rare earths, is both true and dangerously incomplete. Let's go back further because this story doesn't start with a fishing boat. It starts with a sentence. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping, the man who had already spent over a decade dismantling Mao's isolationist economy and opening China to the world, toured the rare earth mining regions of Inner Mongolia. And he said something that, looking back, reads less like a passing comment and more like a blueprint. He said China's rare earth resources could be likened in importance to the Middle East's oil. Sit with that for a second. This is a man who had watched the 20th century get shaped, bent, and occasionally broken by who controlled petroleum. He watched embargoes topple assumptions about Western invincibility. He watched entire foreign policies get built around a barrel of crude. And in 1992, at a point when China was still, by global standards, a minor player in rare earth production, he looked at 17 obscure elements on the periodic table, elements most people couldn't name, elements that don't explode or catch fire or make headlines, and he called them the next oil. Why would anyone believe that? In 1992, rare earths weren't powering anything glamorous. No electric vehicle industry to speak of. No offshore wind farms. Smartphones didn't exist. The applications that would eventually make these elements indispensable, precision-guided missiles, MRI machines, the tiny magnets that let your phone vibrate, the far larger magnets that let a wind turbine spin efficiently at low speeds, most of that was still years, in some cases decades, away. Deng wasn't reacting to the market that existed. He was betting on the market that would exist. And that bet is the reason we're having this conversation today, 30-some years later, still trying to catch up to a decision made before most rare earth applications had even been invented. So what did China actually do with that 30-year head start? This is where the story gets more interesting than China has a lot of rare earth mines, because that framing, the one you'll see repeated everywhere, actually understates what happened and points you at the wrong target. Start with the raw numbers, because they matter, and they're more complicated than the headlines suggest. In global rare earth mining, actually pulling ore out of the ground, China accounted for roughly 69% of world production in 2025. That's a big number. It's not a small one. But it's also not the number people usually throw around, and it leaves real room for other countries. The United States mined about 13%, Australia around 7%, Myanmar contributed roughly 6%. So if you're just counting who owns the holes in the ground, China is dominant, but the world isn't shut out. There's ore coming from multiple continents. Here's the twist, and it's the twist this entire video hangs on. Mining the ore is the easy part. It's the beginning of a chain, not the end of it. Rare earth ore comes out of the ground as an unglamorous, chemically tangled mess of oxides bound together with other minerals. And in that raw state, it is close to useless. You cannot put raw, rare earth ore into a Tesla motor or an F-35 targeting pod. Before any of these elements become the ultra-strong permanent magnets that make electric motors, wind turbines, and precision weapons work, that ore has to go through a separation and refining process. Dozens of chemical steps to isolate individual elements like neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium from each other and from everything else they're bound to. And that processing step, not the mining, the processing, is where China's share of the world doesn't sit at 69%. It sits at roughly 90%. Read that gap again because it's the whole story in two numbers. China mines 69% of the world's rare earth ore but refines about 90% of it. That extra 20-some points doesn't come from Chinese mines. It comes from ore mined in Australia, in the United States, in Myanmar, in a dozen other places that gets shipped, often literally by container ship, into China to be processed because almost nowhere else on Earth has built the industrial capacity to do it at scale. The rest of the world's mining industry effectively works for China's refining industry, whether it means to or not. Why does that distinction matter so much? Because refining is the choke point, not the mine. You can, in theory, open a new mine in a few years if you've got the capital and the political will. Messy, slow, expensive, but doable. Rare earth separation facilities are a different animal entirely. They require enormous investment, years of specialized engineering, environmental permitting, that Western countries have historically been reluctant to grant because the wastewater from rare earth separation is genuinely nasty. Radioactive byproducts, toxic acids, the kind of industrial footprint that gets a plant permit denied in California or Germany, but approved without much friction in parts of inner China. So, while the world was mining rock in various corners of the globe, China spent 4 decades quietly building the one piece of the puzzle nobody else wanted to build. The dirty, capital-intensive, environmentally punishing middle step that turns rock into usable metal. And once you own that step, you don't need to own every mine on Earth. You just need everyone else's ore to eventually pass through your facilities, because there's nowhere else for it to go. That's the 90%. Not China controls rare earths. China controls the bottleneck all rare earths have to pass through. Now, why should you, watching this on your phone or your laptop, actually care about a chemical processing statistic? Because that 90% isn't sitting in a warehouse somewhere. It's already inside your life. Take the device you're watching this on. It likely contains a small amount of rare earth material, a tiny fraction of its total mass, but a functionally critical one, in the speaker magnets and the vibration motor. Scale that up. A typical electric vehicle uses somewhere in the range of 1 to 2 kilograms of rare earth material, concentrated almost entirely in the permanent magnet inside its drive motor, the component that actually turns electricity into torque. No magnet, no motor, no car. And go to the more sensitive end of the spectrum. An F-35 fighter jet depends on rare earth elements across its sensors and precision-guided targeting systems, and the same kind of magnets show up in missile navigation and steering systems. This isn't a consumer electronics story anymore at that point. It's a national security story too, and it's been one since long before most people were paying attention. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the elements inside your phone, your car, your country's power grid, and your country's fighter jets all pass through the same processing bottleneck controlled overwhelmingly by one country, what happens when that country decides, for any reason, political or economic, to squeeze? You already saw the answer. It happened in 2010 with a fishing boat, and it happened again, more deliberately in July 2023, when China placed new export controls on gallium and germanium, two more obscure but critical materials used in semiconductors and defense electronics. Different elements, different year, same fundamental move, proof that the processing chokehold carries real teeth. not just theoretical weight. It's a lever that gets pulled when it serves a purpose, and the rest of the world has now watched it get pulled more than once. Which raises the obvious follow-up. If everyone can see the danger of depending on one country for something this critical, why hasn't the rest of the world just built its own refining capacity? Why didn't the United States, with all its wealth and industrial history, simply do what China did? The uncomfortable answer is that the West had exactly that capacity once, and let it go. Rewind to the 1980s and into the 1990s. A company called Magnequench, based in Indiana, was one of the world's leading producers of the powerful neodymium iron-boron magnets that would go on to become essential in everything from hard drives to precision-guided weapons. General Motors owned it. It represented genuine cutting-edge American capability in exactly the technology that would matter most decades later. In 1995, GM sold Magnequench to a consortium with financial ties to Chinese state-linked interests for a price in the neighborhood of $70 million. Within roughly a decade, sometime in the early 2000s, accounts vary on the precise date, the company's actual manufacturing equipment was crated up and shipped out of Indiana to China. Not licensed, not partnered. Physically relocated. The machines that made the magnets left the building and they didn't come back. Nobody blocked the sale on national security grounds, even though the technology sitting inside those factories would, within a generation, become one of the most strategically important materials on the planet. No sabotage was involved, and no single villain made one catastrophic call. What happened instead was a chain of ordinary business decisions. Sell the underperforming division, take the best offer, move on. Made in a decade when almost nobody in Washington was thinking about magnets as a national security issue. By the 2010s, China's share of global NdFeB magnet manufacturing had climbed to somewhere around 85% and higher, and Magnequench's old capability was part of the reason why. Then there's Mountain Pass, the mine in California's Mojave Desert that was, for decades, the largest rare earth mining operation outside China. Through the back half of the 2000s and into the 2010s, Mountain Pass tried to compete against Chinese producers who could mine and process at a fraction of the cost, partly because they weren't absorbing the environmental cleanup costs Western regulators demanded. The economics didn't hold. In June 2015, the mine's operator, Molycorp, filed for bankruptcy carrying roughly $1.7 billion in debt. By October of that same year, Mountain Pass shut down entirely, placed into what the industry calls care and maintenance, a polite way of saying the lights went out. For years after that, America's only major rare earth mine sat idle while China's refining share of the global market pushed even higher. The mine has since been revived under new ownership, and it's received government backing as Washington has woken up to the problem. But even now, it still lacks the capacity to process the heavier, more strategically sensitive rare earths, like dysprosium and terbium, on its own. Decades of lost expertise don't rebuild in a few budget cycles. There's one more piece of this history worth knowing, because it shows the world did try to fight back through official channels. And what happened when it did. Starting in 2012, the United States, backed by the European Union and Japan, filed a case against China at the World Trade Organization, arguing that China's export quotas and restrictions on rare earths violated international trade rules. It wasn't a fringe complaint. It was three of the world's largest economies formally accusing China of using its position to distort the global market. China's defense leaned on resource conservation and environmental protection, arguments that weren't entirely without merit, given how genuinely destructive rare earth mining and separation can be to land and water. In 2014, the WTO ruled against China, and the following year, China dropped its formal export quota system in response. You'd think that would have settled things. It didn't, not really, because a ruling about quotas does nothing to touch the underlying structural reality. China still refined roughly 9 in every 10 tons of rare earth material on the planet, quota or no quota. Winning the legal case didn't hand the West a refinery. It just meant China's dominance going forward would operate without the appearance of a formal trade barrier, which in some ways made it harder to challenge, not easier. There was no single lever to point at anymore, just an industrial reality too large and too entrenched to unwind with a court ruling. And if you're wondering whether anyone outside China ever managed to build a real alternative during all this, there's essentially one name that comes up: Linus. an Australian company that mines ore domestically and runs a processing facility in Malaysia. As of the mid-2020s, Lina stands as close to the only commercial-scale rare earth separation operation of any real significance outside Chinese ownership anywhere on the planet. One company, one facility, weighed against a Chinese processing base that took 4 decades and enormous state backing to build. That imbalance alone tells you how far there still is to go. So here's the real shape of the problem, and it's worth pausing on before we get to where this is headed. The West isn't out of rare earths in the ground. That's not it. This isn't even primarily a mining problem. Not when the rest of the world already mines nearly a third of global supply. The real issue is the specific, dirty, capital-intensive, decades-to-build expertise of turning that ore into usable material. Expertise that got sold off, shut down, and allowed to atrophy piece by piece across 3 different decades, while one country kept building. You can't outdig your way out of a refining shortage. You can only outbuild your way out of it. And building takes the one thing geopolitics rarely gives you generously: time. There are signs the rest of the world finally understands this. The European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act, adopted in 2024, set targets for 2030. 10% of the continent's rare earth needs mined domestically, 40% processed domestically, and a goal of recycling 25% of critical materials by that same deadline. The EU has designated a slate of strategic projects meant to help get there, though the first of them aren't expected to actually come online until 2027 at the earliest. That's optimistic on its own terms. Europe still imports somewhere around 90% of its rare earths from China today, and demand for these materials across the EU is projected to grow several times over by 2030, and keep climbing well past that through 2050, which means even a successful build-out may only be racing to keep pace with need, not to close the gap. Meanwhile, new deposits are being discovered and developed outside China's borders. Brazil, in particular, holds the second largest rare earth reserves on the planet after China, with roughly 21 million tons in the ground, and its deposits are unusually rich in the heavy rare earths, dysprosium and terbium, the ones that matter most for high-temperature applications like electric vehicle motors and defense systems. But Brazil's only commercial-scale rare earth mine currently exports raw, unrefined concentrate. It has no domestic refining capacity of its own, which means even with one of the richest deposits on Earth, the ore still has to go somewhere else to become usable. For now, in the base case, that somewhere is still China. That's the pattern again and again, everywhere you look. The mine is rarely the bottleneck anymore. The refinery is. So think back to that fishing boat in 2010. It wasn't really about the boat, and by now you know it was never really about the islands either. It was a demonstration, an almost accidental one, triggered by a collision nobody planned, that showed the entire world exactly where the pressure point sits in a global economy nobody had quite finished building. Deng Xiaoping saw that pressure point coming in 1992, before almost anyone else on the planet understood what these 17 unglamorous elements would become. And for the 4 decades since, while other countries debated, deregulated, sold off strategic assets to the highest bidder, and let critical industrial capability quietly leave the building, one country kept its focus on a single unglamorous, unpopular, environmentally messy industrial step. And built patiently, the choke point that now sits underneath your phone, your car, your country's power grid, and, if it ever came to it, your country's fighter jets. Nobody hid this. There was no secret plan, no leaked memo, no conspiracy that took decades to uncover. Deng said the quiet part out loud in 1992. The West had 3 decades to hear it, 3 decades to respond, and mostly spent that time selling the pieces that mattered to the highest bidder, because nobody was thinking that far ahead. That's not a story about a monopoly seizing control through force. It's a story about patience beating urgency, about a country that planned in decades while everyone else planned in fiscal quarters. The lever got pulled once, quietly, over a fishing boat in 2010. It got pulled again in 2023 over gallium and germanium. The question the rest of the world still hasn't fully answered is what happens the next time it gets pulled, and whether, by then, anyone outside China will have built an alternative worth calling one.